So I'm here for a little bit of a different video today, and that is to discuss how to shop smarter when it comes to buying books so that you can hopefully avoid a buyer's regret. So this video is more about strategies and a bit of a therapy for those book buyers in our midst. And so hopefully you'll find this interesting. And before we get started, a quick disclaimer, of course, that if you are currently happy with how you buy books, even if you buy a lot of books, even if you don't read the books that you buy, that is perfectly fine, as long of course as you are still able to eat and feed your family, all of that. So this video is not meant to shame anyone or change anyone's habits who doesn't want them changed, but I know for a lot of us we want to make the most of the money we have, or at least in my case, I've done a lot of reflection over the year and really looked back to see what works and what doesn't when it comes to buying books and what makes me happiest with my purchasing. So I'm going to use my strategies here to help you, if you want to, buy books a little bit smarter. Let's get started. So first, I think it's important as buyers and readers to define why we buy books, which might seem really obvious, to read them, but that's not always the case. So for the sake of this video, I think I want to split it into two different groups. So while there can be overlap, typically we're buying books for accessibility or for our collections. So when I mean accessibility, I mean to get a hold of a book that you can't otherwise read. So it's not available in your library, you can't borrow it from a friend or something like that. So if you want to read the book, you have to spend money to get it. And then the other reason is more for our collection, and that is kind of a larger category. Some people like to buy books that are their favorites. Some people like to buy books to loan out to friends. Some people just like to have really nice collections of really fancy editions or older vintage books with cool covers. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So I think it's important to be really honest with yourself. What is your objective when you're spending money on books? What type of books, unread or read books, are you trying to pick up? Does the edition matter? And just what is the general goal? So I think that's really important for everything I'm going to talk about after this, that you really have to decide, is it just about attaining access to books that you otherwise cannot read? Or are you purposely going out of your way to collect books that you possibly can get through other sources, but you really want to collect and physically or electronically own? So the next step is to make sure that you are identifying and picking out the right books to buy in the first place based off of your own tastes and preferences when it comes to reading, which seems really obvious, but a lot of people don't really take the time to actually really vet the books that they're about to buy. So I know all of us, we fall for the trap. We see a pretty book on Instagram or some booktuber holds up a book and gets us really excited, so we go out and we buy it. But often enough, just because one person likes a book or one person recommends it or just shows a pretty cover of a book that maybe they haven't even read doesn't mean we are going to be really happy with that purchase. So I don't know if you're aware that even though I have a lot of access to review copies, I spend a lot of time vetting the books that I'm going to read. So one thing I've gotten the habit of, and I'm bad for this sometimes, but I really appreciate when I do it, is before I even request a book from the library, before I buy a book, before I put it on my wish list, I will go and download the Kindle sample to my phone. And I just find that the easiest way. You can obviously download other samples from other locations, but I like that because it gives me a chance to read the first few pages. I have done the terrible thing in the past where I have bought a book, opened it up, and read the first page and realized that I hated the writing style, and then I was stuck with the book. If I had just taken the 2 seconds to download the app and download the book onto my phone, I could have realized that that book and that writer was just not for me and saved myself a lot of money, and of course have ideally bought in something I actually would have enjoyed. So that is something I do as a good habit. And of course with audio, I definitely take the time to always listen to the samples of the audio. Ideally, you can actually listen on the app, which allows you to speed it up. So if you normally listen at 1.5 speed, I recommend speeding up the sample to the same speed so that you can get an idea if it actually sounds right to your ear, because especially when it comes to narration, that can be very hit or miss, which we'll get into a little bit more soon. And the other thing I do to help vet my books is that I look up a lot of reviews, both written and YouTube reviews. So I watch a lot of other booktube channels, even people who don't normally have the same taste as me, and I want to hear them weigh in on the same books that I'm interested in. Sometimes there are certain booktubers where we have very differing opinions. So even if they give a book a bad review, I'm actually more tempted to read it because I know that our tastes differ so much depending on what aspects of the book they criticize. For instance, if someone calls a book too dark, I'm pretty likely to pick it up based off of that critical review. But essentially what I'm trying to do here is create a whole bunch of different opinions that will help me to figure out if the book will work for my taste. So when it comes to getting other reviews, I do recommend finding other people who you know their tastes, so you know how their taste compared to yours. So again, if they give a book a certain criticism or recommendation or review, you know how that's going to translate to your own reading life. So while I do look at random reviews on Goodreads, honestly, I do prefer to go back to my tried and true sources, because I know if so-and-so says this about a book, chances are I'm going to love it too, or vice versa. So I find that really helpful. So I definitely recommend find your people, trust those reviewers, and use them as a guiding point, not necessarily always trusting that if they say buy the book, you still have to discern for yourself, but at least it gives you a bit more information so you're not blindly buying books based off of the marketing hype and the covers and all the things that the publishers do to just wrap us in and trick us into giving away our money for books that may or may not be our favorites. Next, let's talk about buying based off of format. So I think that my opinions on how to shop smartly for books depends on which format you're buying in and which format you're actually going to read. So I think that's the first question. Let's start with audiobooks. And so in my opinion, audiobooks can be a fantastic, very affordable way to purchase books. So again, if your main reason for buying books is simply to get access to them, and you are someone who is comfortable to read them in the digital form, you have a tablet or a Kindle or something like that, then this is definitely your best bang for your buck. But let's be honest, I find that there's a few things there. There's lots of great deals that make books seem really affordable, but if you're spending even small amounts of money on large quantities of books that you're not reading, you're not really spending your money wisely in this case. So the first thing I would ask is, if you bought books on Kindle before, do you even remember that you bought them? Or have you gone on to buy them in other formats because you forgot you bought them? Or even if you bought them, if you're honest, you actually wanted the paperback or audiobook version and you were never actually planning on reading the digital copy to begin with. So I always have to remind myself that no matter how cheap a book is, if I'm not going to read in that format, it's not worth buying in that format, even if it's a couple bucks. If it's free, sure, there's no cost. But if it's a couple bucks, I'd rather use those couple bucks to go towards the format that I'm actually going to be picking up. However, I do want to acknowledge that there's different seasons of life that definitely make ebooks especially advantageous. So for me in the past, when my son was young and I was bottle feeding him overnight, the ability to read books on my phone, just using my thumb to move across the pages as I was feeding him, really helped me get through a lot of books. I did not touch physical books for a while because most of my reading time was in the middle of the night when I couldn't turn on the lights. So that was something helpful there. The other time that I do reach towards Kindle books or other ebooks is when I'm traveling. I am someone who's really bad for taking like 12 paperback books on a plane with me, but realistically, that is a time where I should probably just invest a few dollars and spend some books, because the cost of having overweight luggage is far more expensive than buying a couple ebooks. So that's something to keep in mind, is just depending on your lifestyle, your stage of life, and just what makes sense in a practical standpoint. Next, let's talk about audiobooks, which admittedly is one of my favorite formats, but I fully acknowledge that it's not for everyone. In the past, I've gone through seasons of life where I've done a lot of audiobook reading, and so in those periods, I did invest more of a higher percentage of my reading budget to go and buy audiobooks because I was consuming more and they're harder to get through my library. But as I mentioned, not everyone loves the format. Some people just simply acknowledge that it's not the best way for them to consume a story. Not everyone is an audio learner, and so it's just not going to be very intuitive for them. They find themselves distracted, etc. And so if you are one of them, if you love the idea of an audio, but if you're honest, you'd always prefer reading the physical book, don't buy the audio. Buy the format you want and stick with that. Going along with audiobooks, I also have to once again mention narration, and that is so important. So yes, go check out those samples before you purchase the books and really take the time to make sure that the narration is going to work for you. There are books that I absolutely love. They are all-time favorite books, but I will never spend money on the audiobook narration because I think that the audio performance is pretty terrible. So while there are certain books I love, I purposely go out of my way to spend those dollars on the physical book and make sure that I'm not spending them in a format that I will never ever touch. So that's something to consider as well. And finally, with audiobooks, while yes, libraries do typically have larger physical collections, more and more they are getting larger digital collections. So definitely check if your library has access to Libby or Hoopla, because I've seen it before where there will be an Audible sale and there will be a bunch of audiobooks for $5, but because I use my library system so much, I'm often aware of the fact that I can get those exact same books for free from my library, and depending on what the book is, often I can get them immediately without any wait time or having to put the book on hold. And so it really doesn't make sense for me to buy the book when I can readily access the exact same copy of the narration for free. So that's definitely something to watch. I'll admit there are times that I still have bought audiobooks that are available through my library, but those are typically ones where they're in high demand. It would be, say, a 16 or 20 week wait for that book, or simply one that I love so much that I just want to read it over and over again. But really, if it's in my library system and it's easily accessible, really, I shouldn't be buying those books. So it's something I've really been trying harder to cut back on, is buying books that I can immediately listen to via my library, because that just doesn't make sense. And finally, for format, let's talk about physical books. And once again, I'm going to ask the question, are you actually going to read the books in this format? Now, for a lot of readers, that might seem like a really dumb question to ask, but I happen to know that there are a lot of readers that have transitioned very strongly over to either ebooks or audiobooks. And even if they own physical copies of those books, they will go out of their way to check out those books from the library or buy the Audible edition of the audio or such, and they don't actually even open their physical books. So that's when I think you need to be really honest with you about why you're buying physical books if you're not touching them. Obviously, again, everyone is allowed to do what they want with their money, but if it is tight, if it is somewhere that you're looking to cut down on that spending, I think being honest that sometimes we collect books with no intention of actually touching the object is something that we might want to reconsider, especially if we're looking to kind of change things up. And so I'll be honest, just like there are certain audiobooks I will never buy, there are some physical books that I'm trying not to buy because I already own audio editions of them and I love the narration so much that the only reason I would physically buy a copy would literally to be for my booktube channel to hold it up on camera. And I just can't justify those costs if I'm honest, and I would always go back to the audio edition every time I reread the book. And then moving on, assuming you actually do read physical books, before you purchase any, one thing to always consider is whether or not they're readily available through your library. Again, I understand that new releases often have really long holds, but if you're trying to read a backlist title, chances are it might be available as long as it's not incredibly niche or by an indie author. And so a lot of times I can easily get a book within a week, even though I live in a small town. My province has interprovincial loans, so I can get books easily from anywhere in the province or even other places in the country if I need to. And I know a lot of other systems have similar things in place. So very rarely do I actually need to buy a book when I do have a library system available like this. I recognize not everyone's library system is quite that good, but it is a good starting place. And even if you can't get some from the library, another option is to consider buying used books rather than new physical ones. And the one thing I try to think about before I buy a new book is to consider how easily I could find it at a thrift store, a garage sale, or at a local used bookstore. So there's certain authors that typically whenever I go to the used bookstore, I see tons of Stephen King, Anne Rice, and other authors like that are just highly prolific, that are bestsellers, that tend to have a wide audience. I kind of know who are the readers within my area where I live. So honestly, I have a pretty good guess whether or not I'll easily find their books at my local used bookstore. When it comes to, again, like indie authors or someone really niche or small, those ones I'm more likely to buy online or have to order in from a bookstore because I know my local used bookstore will probably never get a copy. But for someone big and buzzy, I know eventually The Martian or Ready Player One or one of those popular books is going to show up there. And so I really don't feel compelled to buy a new copy when I know I can easily get it used. And of course, if I'm trading in books, I can use store credit, which makes it even more affordable. And as a bonus, if I'm turning in books that I've finished reading and no longer want to keep, I can create store credit, which makes those book purchases used even more affordable or possibly even free with the credit, which I love. And finally, with physical books, the last thing to consider is even if you do have to buy new, consider what format you need to buy in. And that's something to consider, that typically hardcovers are going to be more expensive. Often you have to wait for the paperback version. So again, considering whether or not you're willing to wait. And then often mass market paperbacks are going to be cheaper than the trade paperbacks. And so just be honest with yourself. I'm very lucky that I actually prefer paperbacks and I don't have a problem with mass market. So I just tend to buy the cheapest option available. But of course, some people prefer hardcovers, so that's a choice that you're making, but just know that you're going to get less bang for your buck if you invest in more fancy or more expensive editions of books. So that's something that you always keep in mind. I tend to go for the cheaper version because it means that I can buy more books because I love to read and want all the books all the time. Next, let's talk about the timing of when to buy a book, which seems like a strange thing to talk about, but I'm going to put out a rule of thumb that I follow, and that is the fact that I only buy books when I have a short-term plan to read them. So for example, I one day think that I might read Moby Dick when I'm in my nursing home and I have nothing better to do. I am not going to buy a copy of Moby Dick today because I have no intentions of reading it this week, this month, or even this year. And so I use that same rule of thumb when I'm purchasing any book. And so when I pick up a book or see it in the bookstore or see it at a garage sale or anything like that, I immediately think, when am I going to pick this book up? If I don't know, I need to make a plan, and a short-term plan specifically, otherwise I don't allow myself to buy it. Now, that might seem really extreme and really harsh, but honestly, I found that that rule has made me so much happier with my book purchasing. Because what I found in the past when I used to hold a larger physical TBR is that I would buy a thing, I would be so excited for it, and then I would put it on my shelf and I would leave it for 6 months to a year. And by the time I went to go pick it up, it no longer felt like an exciting new book. Instead, it felt like assigned reading. It felt like something I had to read, and suddenly any other book besides that one was immediately more exciting, more interesting, and I suddenly didn't want to read that book at all. So what I found is I love to buy a book and then ideally immediately read it. If I have to wait a week, that's pretty much as long as I want to wait. Otherwise, I want to dive into the book when I'm so excited by that new purchase. It gives me that rush and excitement of getting a new thing. I get to experience it right away. And also, we'll get into it more in a minute, but by reading the book you buy right away, you immediately get feedback on whether or not that was a good purchase. And that information helps to inform me so that I make better purchases in the future. The other thing to consider when purchasing books online is the fact that I try really hard to never immediately put in a book order. I live in a small town, so I pretty much always have to order books online. And so if I can, I will put the books in my cart and I will leave them at least 24 hours, ideally a week. And then I decide if I actually still want the books by the end of that week. And usually in the meantime, my interest has moved on to other books. I've heard about something else exciting online or on Instagram, and suddenly those books that I was dying to read and dying to own no longer hold the same interest. Occasionally they do, and then I will go about trying to make the purchase. I will fit into my book budget, but often enough, the excitement and fun of putting them into my cart online somewhat satisfies that experience without actually spending money, which is a wonderful thing. So I highly recommend try to hold off if you can on book purchases. Put it all in your cart, plan it out, stack all the books up and see how much the total is, and then wait and see what happens. And from there, just see if you actually even remember that you put those books in the cart, because I've also had times where I totally forgot I was book shopping and the books just, disappear into the universe of the internet and I never miss them. From here, let's talk about some more ways to spend money smarter when it comes to books. The first one is to consider if you are a rereader, which I am, perhaps you can follow a similar rule that I do, and that's the fact that I try really hard to only buy books after I have read them. And by doing so, I'm only then buying my absolute favorites. And so this helps me to be a lot more selective in what I'm buying. And this works for me again because I do reread my favorites regularly. So I definitely get my money's worth out of those books, and I don't have buyer's regret, because in the past I would buy books that I thought were going to be favorites, and when they turned out to not be favorites, because not every book is going to be one, I always felt a lot of buyer's regret and remorse. I just felt like my money was wasted because the book did not meet my impossible expectations, and so buying books after they become favorites have become much more satisfying. That being said, for those of you that don't reread books, I would ask yourself, why are you collecting them? And again, you don't actually need a reason, but I would question, what is your purpose if you will never touch those books again? Will you open them? Do you look at them? Do they actually create daily happiness for you as you see them on your shelves? I know a lot of people say that they buy books to loan them out to friends, but as a lot of booktubers and reviewers will talk about, we don't really like to loan out our books because we don't get them back, or if we get them back, they come back in terrible shape. So my question to you is, if you are buying books to loan them out to friends, are you actually loaning them out to friends, or are you just saying that? Because I know a lot of us say we are going to do that and then we just don't. Next, I'm going to be really harsh here because we've all done it, including myself, but please stop buying sequels when you have not read the first book in a series. And even more so, if you haven't read book 2, don't buy book 3. Even if you love book 1, you have no idea when the series is going to fall off for you. And I know we've all done it and bought the 9-book series thinking it was going to be our new favorite. We read book 1, we hated it, and then we had to unhaul 8 other books unread and feel all the shame and the money going down the drain, so don't do it. Along a similar line, I would actually extend that to say, don't buy multiple books by the same author until you confirm that you at least like one of their books. So I know there are a lot of popular authors out there that are very prolific, and a lot of times, again, we think that an author is going to be our favorite, so we buy all of their books and then we read one and we don't really like it. And then we read another one of theirs and we don't really like it. And now we have a whole collection of their books that we don't really like. So for me, when I do allow myself to buy books that I haven't read yet, I typically restrict it to authors that have already proven themselves to be favorites. And I know I'm basically going to love their other books. But if I'm trying an author for the first time, even if they are very beloved online, I don't know if they're going to work for me. So I buy their books one at a time, ideally borrowing them if I could, and I'll go from there, and they have to earn their way into becoming an auto-buy author for me. Also, if you are like me and get lots of emails from bookish websites that are constantly tempting you with sales and deals, I do recommend unsubscribing. For me, I pretty much only allow myself to check out those sites around Black Friday and after Christmas when the best deals come in. I know I'm going to get the best percentage off when I purchase, and so otherwise I try to unsubscribe so I'm not even looking. Unless I'm actively searching for books, I don't want to just be browsing, because we all know that that just leads to trouble. Along a similar note, I am someone who goes to used bookstores, but what I would recommend is something I do, and that is that I go in with a list. So I already know what books I'm looking for. If I find those books on the shelf, I'm allowed to get them, but if they're not there, I move along, because if I didn't want that book before I got in the bookstore, I probably don't need to walk out with it. One thing that my used bookstore does allow me to do, which is great, is I can actually put books on a watch list, so they can tell me when certain books come available or show up, when someone trades them in, and they will call me. So this saves me from randomly going into the bookstore and browsing, and instead I just wait for them to call. I go in there, I grab the books I want, I peek at these shelves because I'm there, but at least it saves a lot of trips where I'm just browsing without intention. Instead, I tend to get in, get my book, and try to get out as quickly as possible and make it just a little bit more focused when I'm there. And last is something I mentioned already, but is honestly my #1 recommendation for this entire video, and that is to audit and review your previous purchases. So I would actually recommend going back and looking at the books you bought last month, last year, the year before that, and figure out, have you actually read them? If you haven't read them, why not? And if you have read them, how did it work out? Do you regret buying them now? And that, I'll be honest, is actually the biggest thing that transformed my own buying habits when it came to books, is I looked back and found myself continually regretting books that I was buying, and I knew I was doing something wrong. Again, if you're someone who is always happy with your purchases and it's not causing you any undue physical strain or stress, that's a whole different story. But for me, I was just really unhappy with the way I was spending money on books, and I kept regretting what I was doing, so I knew I had to do something different. And that is how I created the rules I talked about in this video here. And so I looked back and I realized, particularly, I would buy books that I hadn't vetted. I hadn't looked up Kindle samples and reviews online, and I bought them because the cover sounded good or there was some online buzz or hype. Or I would buy books that I thought were going to be my favorites, and I could have gotten them from the library and tried them first, but I blindly bought them and I didn't end up loving them, and I regretted it. And I would have rather have spent that money on books that I did end up loving, that I actually borrowed from the library. So I've really switched up what I'm doing, and it has made me so much happier as a reader and reviewer. So hopefully some of this will help you as well. So hopefully this video was helpful to some of you. I actually spent a lot of time really thinking about how we spend money on books, but it's not always something that translates into my video content. So I wanted to do something a little bit different today and talk about all that. And again, if you are happy with how you're buying books, continue to do so with no shame, no pain from me. But hopefully this gave you some interesting thoughts, and hopefully we'll create some good discussions in the comments. I would love to hear from all of you. What are your strategies how to spend your money smarter when it comes to books? I would love all your tips and tricks. And another thing to consider is, just because you're trying to spend your money smarter doesn't mean that it always translates to being cheaper, there are times that I do choose to spend more money on books because I want to support a local or independent bookstore, or support an indie author or a marginalized author, or someone who I just really want to give my full dollars to. And then I will perhaps use these strategies to focus on authors that are perhaps bestsellers and maybe don't need my personal money quite as much because I have multiple streams of income from all of the different sources that buy them. So that's something to consider too, is just being very sensitive or thoughtful about how to spend the limited money that you have and how to make the most impact based off your own moral compass, your own financial goals, and all of that. So anyway, I could talk this all day. I really like financial and budgeting videos, but it's not really my main topic for this channel. So if you are still here and stuck around, thank you so much. If you want to give me a thumbs up, I appreciate that. If you want to drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoticon for money. And again, I'd love to hear all your opinions down below. But if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. And if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read and talk about books, including horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.